Today I'm visiting the famous Shaolin Temple, which I actually didn't know that much about before my visit today. I heard about it in the movies. I knew there was Kung Fu, there were Kung Fu monks, but I didn't know very much more. So today certainly opened my eyes to an awful lot here at the Shaolin Temple. Apparently it started off with a Buddhist monk from India coming up to China, and he founded the temple here in the year 495. And he had this idea that meditation should be combined with physical exercise. So for the last 1,500 years, they've been perfecting the exercise, and what we have today as Kung Fu is the result of that.
When we got here this morning, we started out at the pagoda forest, which is a cemetery of sorts where the Shaolin monks who have passed on are buried, and they leave pagodas honoring them.
This burial ground has been there for about 1,500 years, and there are some amazingly old stone pagodas there.
One of the most touching parts of the pagoda forest was a child pagoda where the younger monks who had been involved in Shaolin and trained were cremated and their ashes were put in and burned. They didn't have any kind of medicine back then, so when a child was injured, they often died. And it was really touching in this forest of giant towering pagodas that there was, a little spot for the kids where they were remembered.
After the pagoda forest, we went to one of the Kung Fu schools here in town, and we saw them do a performance, an exhibit of their art, and it blew me away.
It's an amazing acrobatic, I don't even know how to describe it. People are all over the place. They're doing backflips and breaking swords over their heads and doing bicycle kicks and flips and spins. And it's like the movie's taken up a notch. It's even better than the best movie I've ever seen. And these are young kids. The youngest one in the class we saw was 9 and the oldest was 22. And just across that age range, there's a variety of skill, and they're each perfecting different weapons and different techniques.
My favorite weapon was this incredibly large whip that there were 4 men on this stage, which was not that large, just whirling this whip around them. Every time they'd crack the whip on the floor, it sounded like an explosion. And I have no idea how they controlled such a large, probably very heavy whip, but it was just exciting. First, their amazing skill, but second, the just explosive noises that it made. So that was my favorite part.
There's one guy who all the rest of the students brought out a giant tree trunk, and he stood there and focused his chi down low in his stomach, and they rammed the tree trunk straight into him, and he didn't wince, he didn't show that it even hurt at all. And that's one of the tenets of the Shaolin monk code, is that they have to be able to withstand pain, and they have to be able to endure suffering, and endure suffering they can. This guy, he really had it together. And then there was another performance with a guy who took 2 pieces of metal, and he again took some time and he focused his energy and broke the pieces of metal right over his head, just cleanly, just snap, and they were gone, 2 pieces. There was one student who only had 1 arm, and he had arrived at the school with 1 arm, but through dedication and focus, he could keep up with everybody else. When it was his turn to perform, he wasn't hindered or left behind in any way. He kept up right there with the rest of them. I think that speaks to the adaptability that they learn. Just kind of being reformed as an Iron Man. And on a more personal note, to me this is so interesting and so special because I grew up on it. My friends and I, we watched Kung Fu late at night on both American and Asian television. We were plugged into it, and a lot of contemporary American culture has stemmed from basically the Shaolin. Hip-hop co-opted it with Wu-Tang and their martial arts kind of kung fu fighting styles. And in the early 1980s, when breakdancing appeared on the streets of New York City, the moves that you see in a subway station in Chelsea are the same moves that I saw today on stage in China. You know, and those are the same moves and the same styles that have been built up over the last 1,500 years. And that right there is the Shaolin, this harmony and this flow. When you bring it all together, there's a power in the air. You know, it's electric.
After the performance, we got to talk to the guys who had been performing. It was just really neat to see what their life is like. It's a strange thing. They're here at a school, they're living in a dormitory, and they are practicing martial arts all morning long. They get up at 5 and they have a series of practices. On some days they do these performances for visitors, and then they might have some studies in the afternoon, regular school studies, but they're up until 10 at night. I can't really imagine what it's like as a child to be in this amazingly disciplined and physically demanding situation. And we asked them why they weren't just completely exhausted. The man who'd been there the longest, who was about 22, he said that when you first start out, it is incredibly exhausting and they're tired all the time, but that after 5 years or so, you get really strong and you get used to it. So I don't know how they get through the first 5 years, but they certainly looked very, very strong.
Unfortunately, it looks like they take a vow of chastity, and they don't have the option of having girlfriends. So, you know, guys, sorry, but that's part of it.
It was funny sitting there afterwards talking with all these folks. That the youngest boy, who was 9, very quiet and pretty shy with us, but I just kept thinking, like, this little 9-year-old who doesn't really come up much past my waist could totally kick my ass. I mean, yeah, it would probably take him about 2 seconds to have me on my face, like pleading for mercy. So it was kind of funny to see this cute little kid there. Very, very quiet, but probably deadly. After seeing all these kids in the school, we came up to the temple itself. The temple is spectacular. I mean, it's probably the most spectacular Buddhist temple I've ever seen, and I think that probably has to do with its historical importance. I think a pretty well-off or well-funded monastery, because it's been connected with the Emperor of China for a really long time. There's a story that back in the 7th century there was a Tang dynasty emperor who was threatened by a rebel, and he called on the Shaolin monks for help, and 13 monks saved the emperor from this rebel and captured the rebel, and so the emperor was incredibly indebted to them. The Buddhist monks are vegetarian and don't have alcohol, but he gave the monks of Shaolin Temple a special privilege that they could eat meat for strength and alcohol for courage, although apparently no one's really sure if they actually took him up on this privilege, but it just shows that he was really indebted to them. For the first time today in the Shaolin Temple, I burned some incense as a sign of worship to the Buddha, and it was the first time I'd done it, and I found it to be very peaceful and reflective thing to do. We gave it a bit of a donation and took 3 sticks of incense, and with both hands, using both hands shows sincerity in your worship. And then we bowed 3 times in front of the Buddha. 3 times represents your past life, present life, and future life. So does the 3 sticks of incense. After bowing to the Buddha, we took the incense outside and placed it in a big, almost an urn full of other people's sticks of incense. And once you've placed them there and the incense is wafting off, you can say a prayer to the Buddha, to asking for something you need. It makes you stop for a second and first just to think about why the temple is there in the first place. I mean, obviously it wasn't created for the sake of developing a martial arts technique. It's there for a more spiritual reason. And it also makes you think, when you have a chance to wish for something, it makes you stop and think for a second about what's the most important thing that you need to wish for.
love traveling. I like seeing the Shaolin Temple and being on the grounds, having the opportunity to sit and talk to the students. I mean, education is learning your place in the world. Education is kind of learning what's out there and seeing what other kinds of people are out there and how what they do the same as you and what they do differently than you, and how their perspective is different from your own perspective, and you can kind of fold that in and take that with you forward. And today I saw that. Being at the Shaolin Temple, it makes me think that maybe I need more discipline in my own life sometimes, you know? Some punches, maybe I gotta let go. Maybe I gotta learn to fall and learn to roll.
The biggest part of being in Guangzhou is having a sense that my impression of China is getting a little more depth to it, and that I got to see Beijing, which is a really unique place, and then we're getting to see Guangzhou, which is probably more of the sort of place where most Chinese folks actually live. So that's what I really liked about being here.